Hello and welcome to the weekly Independent Sage briefing. We're now 18 months into the pandemic, and the damage that it's done to our collective physical, mental, economic health is undeniable. But there's increasing evidence that the lives and livelihoods of women have been affected disproportionately. And that's why today Independent Sage is hosting a special session on the impact of the pandemic on women in the UK and globally. So here with us today to help bring to light these specific issues are Dr. Claire Wenham, Associate Professor of Global Health Policy at the London School of Economics, and Marion Sharples, Head of International Partnership and Training Work at the Women's Budget Group. We'll also have a quick run through all the latest data with Professor Christina Pargel. We'll do that later on in the session. But first, we're going to start with a Q&A discussion with our special guests, which will be introduced by Dr. Zubaida Haq and Professor Martin McKee. So Zubaida, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to have two fantastic guests with us today. As Jim said, we have Dr. Claire Wenham, who's the Associate Professor of Global Health Policy from the London School of Economics, and Marion Sharples, who's the International Partnerships and Training at the Women's Budget Group. Now, for a long time now, you've heard us talk about inequality, and we've said, of course, Independent Sage have said from the outset that inequality this is a pandemic of inequality, and we've been acutely aware that not everybody has been in the same boat, even though we've been weathering the same storm. And I think nowhere is this more apparent than the impact on women. But of course, we hear very little about that, which is why we invited our fantastic guests to come along today. Now, Marion Sharples, as I mentioned, is from Women's Budget Group. And I don't know if you know Women's Budget Group. Hopefully you will after today. They're a fantastic women's organization, if you like. They look at sort of international feminist economics, and they've been doing lots of work on the impact of COVID-19 on women, and really bringing that research to light in the absence of any action by government. Dr. Claire Wenham equally has been working both with Women's Budget Group but many other organizations, and has been doing very similar work, specializing in global health security and the policy of pandemic preparedness and outbreak response. Both our guests have done lots of work in this area. Now, I'm conscious of time, and I really want our guests to say a lot more about this. So without any further ado, I'm going to start with a question to Marion about some of the work that she's been doing at Women's Budget Group. Marion, sorry, where are you, Marion? You wait with me, Marion, through your research at Women's Budget Group, as well as, of course, with other organisations, can you tell us all the different ways that COVID-19 has had an impact on women in terms of the social, health, economic and labour market impacts? And as well as talking women, I'm conscious we tend to sort of look at women as a homogenous group. Could you tell us a little bit more if and whether that different groups of women have been affected more, or if you like, worse than other groups of women?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Zubaida, and it's really wonderful to be here today. Thank you very much for having me. So in terms of impacts of COVID on women, different groups of women, obviously, I think the first port of call is to look at health and care workers, who obviously have been at the front line of the pandemic, often without adequate protective equipment, and who have had significantly higher mortality rates than the rest of the population. We know that the majority of health and care workers are women. We know that many are also from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic background. So 1 in 5 NHS workers, for example, is from a BAME group. And many are also migrant workers. So that's a really important line to think about as well when we're thinking about access to social security, for example, much of which is not available to migrant workers, even though in many cases they have been fighting the pandemic on the front line. Another group I think to mention that's really important is mothers. So we all know that many childcare facilities have had to close in droves over the last year. There's been over 2,000 childcare providers closed just between January and March of this year. And we know that when childcare facilities are closed, it's mothers who pick up the slack. Mothers have been more likely to be furloughed than fathers, and the overall employment rate of mothers has also dropped, and more significantly so than fathers. And then when we look at the financial impact of the crisis, I think this is a really important one to take into account, because we see, the extremes really, where rich people have been increasing their savings and poorer people have been getting more and more into debt. And of course, that is not equally spread across the population. So now we're facing a situation where about 1 in 5 people are running out of money, always or most of the time, before the end of the week or the end of the month. And that's an additional 4.2 million people compared to the start of the crisis. And as I say, that's not spread easily. So we have more women than men reporting being negatively financially affected by the COVID pandemic. So 30% of women compared to 26% of men. Over half of people who've fallen behind on at least one household bill are disabled, which I think is a really striking statistic. 1 in 4 people has caring responsibilities. One in 4 people who are falling behind on bills have caring responsibilities, and we know the majority of those are women. 1 in 3 people caring for an older person has had to borrow money from a commercial lender. And also bringing in the race disparities here. 1 in 3 Black people are behind on their bills compared to 1 in 8 for white ethnic groups, which is another striking statistic. And I think it's really important to take this into consideration alongside the fact that the combined wealth of Britain's super rich has risen by 36% from the start of the pandemic. And we know that many high-income households have been saving more, and not only have they been saving more, but there is most of those savers are planning to continue saving that money as opposed to spending it, which I think is really important to take into account as we move into as we look towards a recovery out of the pandemic. And then the final point I'll just make here in this opening question, I could go on for a long time, but I just want to make the point about well-being and reported levels of well-being, and how those have also been really important. And I think it's important to highlight that some of the work that we've done, the research that we've done, has showed the impact particularly on well-being in among young women, which is also something to consider. So yeah, I'll finish there on that one, Zubaida, but happy to pick up some of these points in additional questions.
Thank you, Marion.
Great, thank you very much. Maybe I can turn to Claire now. Claire, you're an expert in global health policy. I'm just wondering if there are any common threads that you have seen in terms of gender disparities, and in particular, the worsening of the gender gap as you look across the world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for letting me come and talk to you today. So absolutely. I mean, as someone who studies gender, we learn that gender is really context specific, and it's really hard to have global trends. But actually, this crisis has exposed the same story globally. We're running a research project at the moment looking at the gendered impact in 12 different countries around the world. And really, the story is exactly the same and very similar to what Marion has been talking about. For example, job loss is much more pronounced amongst women globally. Up to somewhere between 2 and 5 times more likely to lose your job if you're a woman rather than a man. And this is partly because of the sectors women tend to be employed in. So, tourism, hospitality, retail, but also particularly in lower middle income countries, women make up a disproportionate amount of people who work in the informal economy. So, street hawkers, vendors, domestic workers, who are having to go out to work because they need to, earn money to feed themselves and their children. But these are also the jobs which have basically been lost as kind of normal economic routines are not happening. And this isn't just a problem now for the reasons we can see, people losing incomes, but we're also seeing, similar to Marion, our data showing, really severe impacts on women's burnout and stress, inversely proportional to age. But we're also seeing worrying signs, particularly amongst women, of things like food insecurity, and women skipping meals to feed their children. and much more so amongst women than men in different parts of the world. So this is, a really important issue. The other thing that might be slightly different to in the UK is we're seeing a lot of girls falling out of education in different parts of the world. As schools have shut and as they've started to reopen, we've seen much more boys going back to school than girls going back to school. And this is obviously going to have a much longer term impact on women's economic empowerment and futures. But it's because they've been absorbing the labor at home, looking after other children, for example, or because their parents have lost jobs, they've had to go and get jobs themselves. So it really is a kind of a global phenomenon. And then the other thing, just to mention, it's not just about employment. It's also, we're seeing disparities in access to antenatal care and sexual reproductive health services and maternity services. And this is also quite worrying. It's both supply and demand problems. So sometimes it's, like in the UK, they've changed the way they provide maternity care to women, or changed the way you can access contraception to try and reduce stress on the NHS. But it's also women not wanting to go and seek these services because they see clinical settings as a point of transmission. And this is having real world effects. So, some of the limited data we have on this from places like Nepal and Brazil, we're seeing increased rates of maternal mortality, increased rates of neonatal mortality, of stillbirths. And here in the UK, we're seeing some signs of not those trends, but increased rates of things like postnatal depression and women not being able to feel like they're receiving the quality of care they're expecting.
Well, you anticipated what would have been my second question there. So thanks very much for that. And let me pass back to Zubaida.
Thank you, Claire. That was really helpful, and that actually leads me on to, I suppose, a sort of an obvious question, Marion, which is, and Claire touched on this, which is that it's clear that women have been incredibly vulnerable, exposed, and at risk in this pandemic, but it's not as clear why. Why is it that women have been at risk? Is it to do with pre-existing inequalities? Is it to do with government policies? I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how women came to be so vulnerable in this pandemic.
Absolutely. I think one of the really important things to think about here is how women are situated in the economy and how that is different to men, and why that is. And a lot of it comes down to the fact that women continue to be disproportionately responsible for unpaid care. And that really has knock-on effects in many ways. It has impacts in the type of jobs that women can choose, where those jobs are located, how well those jobs are paid, the prospects of women in those jobs for promotion and getting into senior levels. So it has these kinds of the responsibility of unpaid care that disproportionately falls on women's shoulders, that has so many knock-on effects, and we've really seen that, and that feeds through to kind of the priorities that women have not being taken on board by those in decision-making positions. And then we have things, for example, like if we're looking back at the last 10 years or so, we've had 10 years of austerity, and we've done research to show what impact that has had on different groups of people. And unsurprisingly, women have been adversely affected, particularly women of colour, disabled women, and single mothers. So we can really see that the kind of the foundations, I suppose, to weather a pandemic like this had already been weakened and already had those gendered impacts built in. So it's not surprising in some ways that we're in the situation that we are in. And I think a really important point to point out is how the lack of investment in our social infrastructure over the last 10 years has also contributed to this. So we're looking not only in terms of public services and shortage of ICU beds and things like that, which have obviously has been highlighted drastically in the pandemic, but also our social security system, which is incredibly punitive in so many ways. And I think we can look at statutory sick pay, for example, which is clear that you can't live on it, and it's also clear that why statutory sick pay as part of a social security system is really about an investment in society as opposed to payments to individuals. Because if you are not able to access statutory sick pay, for example, if you don't have recourse to public funds, or you're unable to survive on it, which is completely understandable at £96 a week, you're going to go to work. You're going to continue to go to work, and of course, in a pandemic, that has huge knock-on impacts for the rest of society. So I think this is a really strong example of how social security needs to be seen as an investment in society, and much more than simply payments to individuals. So I feel there's a lot happening. There's a lot, a lot kind of that has caused this. And I think just one last thing I would like to say is this kind of, it's often seen caring work, because women have currently carry a disproportionate responsibility for unpaid care. There's an assumption that women are natural carers, naturally good at caring, that kind of thing. So then when that is done, when women do carry out paid work, that is it's undervalued, it's underpaid, it's taken for granted, because it's associated with things that women overwhelmingly do unpaid. So I think that's an also really important kind of connection to make. And I think we saw it in the Chancellor's words back in January, where he was talking about mothers in this context, and he said, we owe mums everywhere an enormous debt of thanks for juggling paid work and childcare over the pandemic. That was all it was. It was thanks. There was no kind of no other recognition, no need for structural change. How can we do this differently going forward? None of that. It was thanks. It was almost expected in that sense. And I think that a lot of that kind of expectations around unpaid care, and how when a crisis happens, women will be the ones to pick up the pieces. I think that's been playing a huge role here.
Thank you, Marion. And incidentally, Marion led a piece of work, for 2 years at the Commission on Gender Equal Economy, which is all about the role of women in the caring economy and how we need to look at the economy differently and do things differently. So if you want to know more, please go on their website and look up Commission on Gender Equal Economy. Martin, I think you had another question.
I do indeed. And again, coming back to Claire, one of the words that hit me, Marion, was when you said it wasn't surprising. And of course, Claire, it wasn't surprising, because we've had Ebola, we've had Zika, we've had lots of crises, and one after another, it is women that have been disproportionately affected. So we knew this was going to happen. So why was it, given all of this, that women's interests and the issues affecting women were not factored in at the very beginning? What went wrong? Why were they excluded from the debate?
I mean, that's the $1 million question, Martin. So, I mean, look, we knew this was going to happen. We've seen very similar trends during Ebola. Women disproportionately lost their jobs in Sierra Leone. It took them longer to get back in the workforce afterwards. The same during Zika. Even with maternal health stuff, more women died during Ebola, during the peak of Ebola in Sierra Leone, of maternal mortality and associated conditions than people died of Ebola, right? And that doesn't get talked about, the fact that the distortion of the health system has these secondary effects. And so we knew this. And in fact, I remember being in a meeting with people from the Cabinet Office last February and saying, hello, what about the women? And they said, oh, London's not Liberia. It won't happen here. It's not something that we need to concern about. But obviously that is a complete lie. Now, it depends how cynical you're feeling as why didn't government think about it. I think part of it is the tyranny of the urgent, right? Like, we're right here, we've got to deal with the numbers, we've got to kind of focus on that. But I think it also is partly, well, if we talk about it and recognize it, we've got to do something about it, right? And it's actually quite convenient if women absorb this labor, because that means that we haven't got to figure out another source of it. And so, it's not really in the government's interest to try and do anything about it. And I also wonder whether the government were getting the right advice, right? Were there gender advisors talking to them saying, if you implement this policy, if you shut schools, if you close workplaces, this is how women and different women in the society are going to happen. Now, we've got a whittled down government equalities office. Also, all our policy in the UK is supposed to go through an equality impact assessment to try and pick out these impacts that are going to happen, not just on women, but on all different marginalized groups. And, we still haven't seen that comprehensively. We've seen parts of it, for example, parts from the Department of Health and Social Care, but we haven't seen it from the Treasury, for example, or from the Cabinet Office. And so, were they actually asking these questions?
So as we move into hopefully a recovery later on in the year, have you any hope that there will be a sort of gendered perspective on how we build back better, or can we forget about that?
I mean, I have hope. I don't know how realistic it is. I think, we know that there are key things that you can do to policies to make them more gender sensitive or gender transformative. You can simply ask the question of like, where are the women? What's happening to people in different ways here? And so you can kind of mainstream policy and try and recognize some of these impacts to give the different devolved administrations their credit. Scotland is actually doing a much better job of this than other parts of the UK at the moment by recognizing some of the paid and unpaid gendered work that happens across our societies. But we also need to think about, well, where are the women at the moment? If they're losing their jobs, are those jobs going to exist in the future? So we know women disproportionately work in retail, hospitality, tourism. Will that look the same in the future? I don't know. If not, are we focusing on training or other opportunities for these women who have lost their jobs? The other big thing that Marion picked up on about, childcare. Our childcare sector has been completely decimated by COVID. That's the building block that you need to have women back in the economy. Like, what is the government doing to make sure that the childcare sector is bailed out and, there are those structures in place?
So we're almost out of time, but I want to leave the last word to Zubaida because I think she has a final question for you both.
Well, I do. I mean, I was going to ask you both, where do you think Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock stand when it comes to women's issues? But perhaps today's not the best day to be asking that. And I'm conscious that maybe our other guests would like to come in right now, just very quickly, and ask our guests any questions that they think that we haven't asked them. So I'll open it up to our guests right now. Is there anyone? Right. Well, in that case, can I throw that question back at you, Marion and Claire? Do you think Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock? Where do you think Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock stand when it comes to issues affecting women?
I can jump in quickly. Look, I think everything you need to know about how the government consider women is, look at who is the Minister for Women. We have Minister of Women, Liz Truss, which is a joint appointment as the Minister for International Trade, right? That you can see what the priority is in her role. Women aren't taken seriously by this government, both at a government level, and I think, what's happened overnight speaks for itself for certain individuals in the government. But, even when Boris Johnson is asked about these things, he's been asked in select committees about the impact on women of the thing, and he kind of just laughs about it and kind of turns it into a joke. And so I think, no one is really taking this seriously.
Marion, would you like the last word on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is seen as a nice to have. I think it's an absolute blind spot across the government, and I think that it's even in the kind of the recovery plan, we were talking about Build Back Better and everything, and it's all about construction. It's all about these very kind of typical male industries. Whereas actually, some of the research that we've done, which I think is really relevant to share here, is about the returns on investment in the care sector. So we know the care sector is vital. We've seen that more clearly than ever before over the last year or so. And we've done some modelling at the Women's Budget Group, which showed that if we were to invest 1% of GDP in the care sector, this would create more jobs than in the construction sector. 2.7 times as many jobs in the care sector would be created than in the construction sector. And interestingly, that is 6.3 times as many jobs for women, but also slightly more jobs for men because of the indirect and the induced employment that's created as a result of that investment. Not only so that's great for employment, it's also great for well-being because obviously it means that people's care needs will be met, and it's also green investment. Investment in care jobs is about 3 times less polluting per job created than the overall than the equivalent investment in the construction industry. So I think that's really clear and obvious to see. But because it's the care sector, it's sidelined. It's continued to, it's one of those things. It will just manage. Where we have, millions of people who have unmet care needs in this country, and it's not seen as a priority. So that would be my last word: invest in the care sector.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much to our guests. Yeah, thank you so much. And I didn't mention Claire's book, which is The Feminist Global Health Security. So Commission on Gender Equal Economy and the Feminist Global Health Security by Oxford University Press. Look them up, continue to follow them, continue to push the government on issues in relation to women. And thank you both very much. Jim, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Zubaida. Thank you. Thank you, Zubaida and Martin, for leading the discussion, but especially thank you to you both, Claire and Marion. As Zubaida says, so many points, so many things that you brought up that we just really do need to keep. I mean, just Marion's last few points and those statistics are stark. And I think getting that message across can't be done, attempted to be done often enough. So thank you both for joining us. Okay, now we move on to get the latest figures from Professor Christina Pagel. Christina, over to you.
Hi, okay, let me just start the presentation and share my screen. Right. Okay, so just a short presentation today. We'll look into a fuller dive into the data next week. So I'm going to have a quick look at cases, hospitalizations, and what high level of infection kind of means, particularly, given the discussion that we've just been having. So firstly, the number of new cases by reported date, so people who've had a positive COVID test, you can see that basically since the middle of May, since Delta has become dominant, but also since step 3 of the roadmap started on the 17th of May and a lot more places became open, we've had pretty steep increases in cases with over 16,000 reported both yesterday and on Wednesday. And just kind of trying to give you a bit more context, there were 85,000 cases reported in the 7 days to yesterday, and that's more than 3 times what was being reported in the middle of May. So, we are now seeing a lot more COVID cases. In terms of the different nations, so I'm just looking at positivity rates here to show you that it's not just about testing more. All the nations except Northern Ireland are showing increasing positivity rates. Scotland has the highest. The ONS infection survey released today said that in all nations apart from Northern Ireland, Delta is dominant. So it looks like Northern Ireland is effectively protected because it hasn't yet had dominance of Delta, although it is growing there. It's still kind of dominated by hotspot areas. So Scotland has a lot of infection, particularly in the borders in the cities, the northwest, but also recently in England, the northeast of England and Yorkshire and Humber are going up a lot. And then Cornwall in the southwest is also a new hotspot. This is looking at hospital admissions. So this is Scotland per day over the last 6 months. And what's happened is basically that with the vaccination program, we have greatly weakened the link between cases and hospitalization. So a year ago, for the number of cases that Scotland's seeing, which is higher than it's ever been reporting, you would expect to see a lot more hospitalizations. However, that said, it hasn't been broken and hospitalizations are still going up now in Scotland. In England, we're also seeing that in the places where we've had a lot of cases. So the Northwest had quite a steep increase in hospitalizations. Now, that's now coming down slightly, which is interesting given that cases in the Northwest are still going up. The Northeast and Yorkshire has now started rapidly increasing following a really quite rapid increase in cases there over the last few weeks. And the Southwest, our newest hotspot, is also now seeing increases in hospital admissions. And if we kind of want to see, which bits of the population are seeing this. This is a heat map of cases per 100,000 people per week by age group. In England, this is from the 10th of April to the 19th of June by week. And you can see that kind of in April and early May, it was kind of concentrated really in school-age children, so 10 to 19-year-olds. And that's, not least because those were the schools were the kind of biggest indoor places that were open. And then in the kind of middle of May, when indoor spaces really opened up and Delta became dominant, you start seeing the kind of the highest cases shift to the 20 to 29-year-olds. So kind of young adults who are more exposed to COVID, both because they're working out of the home much more than older groups, and also because they are socializing more. And because they're also the last group, the last adult group really to be vaccinated. And really over the last few weeks, cases there have doubled pretty much every week and are really high right now. We also had half term beginning of June, and that kind of created a bit of a break for school children. But since half term, cases have started going up again in school age children. And just looking a bit more at schools, this is the number of pupils in state primary and secondary schools absent because of COVID in England from March to June. And you can see there were quite a lot of absences when schools first went back in March, when there were quite high levels of community transmission. Things really kind of were cut over the holiday, Easter, slow increases. Then Delta became dominant and step 3 started in the middle of May. It started going up. Then we had the half-term kind of break, which reset things. But since half-term, absences have gone through the roof in children. Now, Scotland schools break up in a week or two. But in England, there are another 3-4 weeks left of term. And so I think the next few weeks might be quite difficult for schools. And that's partly because of our vaccination program. So it's going well, but we still have only about 50% of the population fully vaccinated, fully protected from vaccination. And, about a third who haven't got any protection from vaccination. And this would include pretty much all children. So that's kind of partly why schools are an issue right now, because we don't have that much protection in them from vaccination. The vaccine program's also been slightly slower this week. We've been giving fewer doses. So that's partly because 8 to 12 weeks ago, we weren't doing many first doses because we were concentrating on second doses. So that means that now there aren't that many people to give second doses to. And also our first doses now have to be Pfizer or Moderna because they're all the under 40s, mainly under 30s. And we just have some constraint limits on how much Pfizer and Moderna we have. So we are still vaccinating, but we're not doing as many doses a week as we have been. And now I just wanted to say something about deprivation. So this is looking at the proportion of what are called MSOAs. These are small regions in England of about 6,000 to 8,000 people. And this is looking at how many of them have really high case rates. So case rates of over 150 cases per 100,000 people per week between August last summer and the 19th of June, so last week. And it's split out by deprivation, where the red line is the most deprived areas and the green is the least deprived. And you can see throughout that cases have been highest in the most deprived areas. And as cases have been increasing over the last month or two, you can see that it's disproportionately increasing in the most deprived areas. So that almost a third of the most deprived MSOA areas have case rates of over 150 per 100,000 per week, compared to only 15% of the least deprived areas. So once again, the burden of COVID is falling on the more deprived communities. And then finally, I just want to say something about long COVID. So the Imperial REACT study, which every month looks at a random population in England and looks at COVID status and ties it into various demographics, released a paper looking at 500,000 people who they've been surveying between September and February, and asked them about persistent symptoms from COVID. So people who had symptoms persisting for more than 12 weeks. So this was 76,000 adults, people over 18 in England who had had COVID. So overall, they found that 37% of people who'd had COVID had at least one symptom persisting for more than 12 weeks. But then it had certain demographic features. So firstly, older people were more likely to have long COVID, were more likely to have a symptom persisting for more than 12 weeks, and more than half of over 75s reporting it. But we still had, even among 18 to 24-year-olds, 30% reported having a symptom at least for more than 12 weeks. Women were more likely to have long COVID than men. And once you've adjusted it for age, they were 50% more likely than men to suffer from long COVID, which obviously has quite big implications, as we've been hearing, for actually women going back into the workplace in COVID. And they also found quite a distinct pattern with deprivation. So people from more deprived communities were more likely to have long COVID than those from less deprived communities. So not only are they more likely to get COVID through exposure, more likely to get very sick from COVID, which we already know from hospitalization data, they're also more likely to end up with long COVID. And there's also a very strong correlation between income and long COVID. So again, people from lower income families are more likely to get long COVID than those from higher income families. So just to summarize, cases are continuing to go up. They're now going up in every nation except Northern Ireland, which is flat, although just the very few recent days in Northern Ireland is showing an increase there now. It still is driven by hotspot areas, which are particularly high, but cases are going up actually in most local authorities in England, Scotland, and Wales. Hospitalizations and deaths actually are rising, but are still at very low levels. Vaccination is going well, but slowing down. But we still have 50% of the population who are not fully protected. Cases are highest in younger people and more deprived communities. And there's more and more evidence emerging of the burden of long COVID, and with significant rates of long COVID in young people and the more deprived communities and in women. So I think, this idea that we can live with high rates of infection because hospitalizations aren't overwhelming the NHS, I think is just wrong. Like, it disrupts lives, it disrupts education as children are sent home from school. It creates a large burden of long COVID across all age groups. And it provides more opportunity for further dangerous variants to arise. I mean, we're basically giving it a chance every time it affects someone to find a new mutation. And I think, this is not okay, and we should not be okay with the current situation. And I will end there.
Thanks very much, Christina. Fascinating as always. Okay, we're going to move on to take questions from the press and the public. And in the light of your last point, Christina, talking about children and long COVID, the first question is one that's come from Twitter, which I will read out, from Cheryl Strossheen, who asks, do you think that herd immunity by infection is the government's intent for our children, including condemning some to long COVID? Yes, Christina.
So I have no idea what their intent is, but if it was their intent, then this is how I would do it, is all I will say.
Zubaida.
And they clearly are doing it when you look at the absolute limited mitigations in schools. There have been very few. I know we say this every week, but nothing has changed. There are very few mitigations in schools. And what's worse, of course, as we've mentioned before, the government took away face masks in secondary schools. We've talked about the critical role of face masks. The government recognise the critical role of face masks because they're asking the public to continue to wear face masks indoors and outdoors as much as you can. But they've removed it. They removed it in schools, secondary schools, on May the 17th, without sharing the evidence as to why it needed to be removed. And worse, now that we know that infection rates are extremely high among younger groups, now that we know that over 250,000 children are missing school at the moment because of COVID, they're still not bringing face masks back. So I think there's no question that they must be pursuing herd immunity through children, because they're not protecting them at all at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Zubaida. So Kit and then Susan.
Yeah, just looking at some of the latest statistics, Zubaida mentioned 250,000 children almost missed school on the 17th of June. That's the latest date. Cases are skyrocketing. They're as high in secondary school pupils as they've been since schools went back in March. We're looking at over 4% of pupils missing school. And in some instances, around 8,000 pupils have missed school because their whole school has had to close because so many classes and teachers are off with COVID. And for me, I find that absolutely astonishing that we're not doing more to protect our schools. Partly we protect schools by keeping cases low in the community. So it's amazing that we're just letting cases rise as they are at the moment. But there are things that we can be doing in schools to bring cases down. And I think if you're a parent, you should be absolutely furious about that. And even if you're not a parent, you should be alarmed at what is being allowed to happen and the disruption that's being caused to the education of our children.
Thank you. Susan.
So we know that the major transmission route for COVID is by aerosol. And that means that the major mitigation for people who have to spend long periods in indoor enclosed places with other people is ventilation. And we have for many months, as have many other organisations and individuals, been saying that if we want to protect our children, if we want to keep children at school, then the basic thing that needs to be done is to ensure good ventilation in all classrooms. This is not a difficult thing to achieve. We haven't heard any reports of this being done systematically, but just to give a contrast, and this has been something that we have raised before, is the example of New York City, where you can go onto a public website and see the ventilation status of every single classroom in every single school in New York. Why can't the UK do that? If we're not doing this basic measure to protect children, one does have to ask the question, why not?
Thank you. Okay, so we now move on. The next question's from Alexandra Thompson from Yahoo.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to be, can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Going a little bit off topic here. As we're focusing on women, I think it's timely to talk about the period problems some women have reported after having a coronavirus vaccine. I imagine that you will say that this should not put any women off being immunised, but can you give some context on if you're concerned, if this is a surprise, does it happen with other vaccines? Just really interested to hear your insight on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to? Carl? I'm not sure who would be able to comment on that.
I think Dinan's burning to answer this question.
Right.
Thank you, Carl. And thank you, Alexandra, for the question. Clearly, this is a source of major anxiety. I have not seen any data published yet which documents the precise impact of vaccination on menstruation, but clearly the whole area of fertility has been a major driver of vaccine hesitancy amongst women, and for that reason we need to prioritize, having our answers right, and having the data to hand to be able to convince women that vaccination is safe. These signals that you mentioned did not come out of the vaccine trials. In other words, we didn't see any evidence of this within vaccine trials, although of course that begs the question, were these sort of data collected as a side effect profile, and therefore it may be that there are rarer cases of these that did not come up, but nevertheless I do think it's essential that we deal with this, and we present, and PHE should, I think, be responsible for producing that data to reassure women, because there's no doubt that some of the more extreme concerns about fertility are not warranted, but nevertheless, this is an impediment to widespread vaccination. So thanks for your question, but I don't have the immediate answer to that.
Thank you, Dina. Zubaida, you wanted to come in.
I'm afraid I don't know the clinical answer to that. But what I will say, Alexandra, is it's a really important question to raise, because we know throughout history, even even recently, women's pain thresholds, women's concerns around their health have been constantly diminished, have been ignored, have been invisible, really. And even in this pandemic, I thought one of the most atrocious decisions the government made at the beginning was saying that when women were going into hospital to give birth, that their partners couldn't join them, because apparently that pain's not, that's not that significant, and other concerns were much more important. So I do think it's a really important one to raise. And as Dean rightly said, it could be that we don't have the data at the moment because that question wasn't asked. So yes, please, let's go back to PHE and let's ask that question.
Thank you. Thanks, Alexandra, for your question. Okay, next one comes from Alan Smith.
Hello, can you see me? I can't see me at the moment.
We can't see you yet, but we can hear you. So
okay. So there seems to be a concerted effort by the government and some scientists to make us believe that we have no choice but to live with COVID, just like we do with flu. However, we know that deaths from flu were all but eliminated last winter, probably because of the measures that were taken to reduce the spread of SARS-CoV-2. Now, I'm just a simple science teacher, so I may have got this wrong, but wouldn't a better public health message from the government advocate for the normalization of simple measures, as has already been mentioned, such as wearing masks and improving ventilation in schools, offices, shops, etc.? Because that not only helps to contain COVID, but also saves thousands from dying from flu every year. What do you think?
Thank you. Martin.
Yeah, well, by coincidence, I've been working much of this morning on a paper which is looking at exactly this, because the way in which we measure excess mortality is to look at the average mortality by week over the preceding 5 or 7, usually 5 years, and then calculate the gap between what we're seeing now and what we saw in the past. But of course, we need to remember that in countries like the UK, we've seen some really quite marked seasonal variations. I mean, 2015, there was a huge increase in mortality in January, when it looks like the NHS was really struggling to cope for a couple of weeks, which was linked to flu, but it wasn't entirely flu. So I think that the observation that these seasonal peaks in mortality, and the UK has always, I wrote a paper on this back in 1987, I think, on excess winter mortality. Death rates in winter have been higher in the UK, in Ireland, in Portugal, and a few other countries than elsewhere in Europe for decades. So we know that it's not inevitable. And we also know that there are years whenever you can, even in when other countries are facing a high rate of influenza, some countries can manage to bring the rates down. So I think that we need to look at that again. And that's precisely what we're doing in this paper we're working on at the minute, where we're looking at that. So I can just say, watch this space. But what I think is clear from what we're arguing is that we have been insufficiently ambitious in our determination to push down on other respiratory infections without necessarily going into all of the restrictions and the lockdowns. But there are things that we could almost certainly do, like greater awareness of face coverings, improved ventilation, a lesson that was learned in 1918, and so on, which could actually mitigate the effects. So I think you're right. We should be turning the question round.
Thank you, Martin. Stephen, did you want to come in?
Yeah.
And then Carl.
I think one of the things that's got in the way of sensible debate around this pandemic is that people have drawn up this binary between lockdown and liberty, as if any measures mean absolute lockdown, and therefore any measures are completely unacceptable, and that liberty means you don't do anything at all. Now, the lesson of history has always been that as we discover new risks, we put in place mitigations in our society which are sensible and which are proportionate and don't inconvenience us too much and keep us safe. So, for instance, as we discovered that we had a risk from airplane hijackings and terrorism, we put in place mitigations in airport security. And everybody accepts they're perfectly sensible. As we discovered more about the risks of smoking and passive smoking, so we began to say, well, we shouldn't have smoking indoors in public spaces. As we discovered, I'm a cyclist, the dangers of head injuries, we started wearing helmets and so on. These are changes in our society, which actually we don't experience as taking away our liberty. Actually, most of us nowadays don't see wearing a seatbelt as taking away our liberty. It feels weird if you don't wear a seatbelt. And inevitably, we're discovering a new risk, and it makes sense to have sensible mitigations that don't inconvenience us too much and keep us safe. And that's why, number one, it is so unhelpful for people to talk about Freedom Day as if that's a day where we completely forget about what's happened and forget about what we need to do to keep ourselves safe. It's why it's so unhelpful for Rishi Sunak to say, I'm not going to wear a mask under any conditions. We're not talking about lockdown here. We're talking about what we've always done, and that is learning about a risk and taking sensible measures and proportionate measures to keep ourselves safe. That's not lockdown. That's, that's staying alive.
Thanks, Steve. So very briefly, Carl and then Susan, because we're going to run short of time. Carl.
I'll try and make it brief then, but if you're a science teacher, I find it very helpful just think about the mechanisms that control viral transmission. And we've said this a number of times, but there are three mechanisms. There's the contact rate that is mitigated by things like travel restrictions, rules of six, and legislation. There's a transmission risk, which part depends upon the characteristics of the virus, but also crucially your personal mitigating behaviors, such as being outside, wearing masks, social distancing. And then finally, there's the mean infectious period. So that affords the opportunity for the government to apply a triple lock to move towards a suppression strategy. So in answer to a previous question, do we think that the government are actually doing that, or are they pursuing herd immunity? I think it's quite evident they're pursuing a herd immunity strategy because they haven't invoked that triple lock, because there's no talk about the final factor, which is the mean infectious period, which of course is eliminated if you isolate people. So the question about the kind of endemic equilibrium that we aspire to, I think, rests very much on whether the government go for that triple lock and that suppression strategy. At the moment, there's no evidence that they're doing that.
Thanks, Carl. Susan.
I just wanted to suggest that we should really challenge the mantra that we need to learn to live with COVID. We don't go around saying we need to learn to live with cancer or with heart disease or with diabetes. We try and do everything we can to prevent it. Why is it any different with respiratory disease? Why is it any different with COVID? So I just want to make that simple point. I just think whenever we hear that, we challenge that.
That's a very good point, Susan. I think we should all be using that. Absolutely. That's a very good argument. Thank you very much, Alan, for your question. Okay, we have 5 minutes left. We've got a couple of questions that I'm sure we can get through. The next one's from Carla Hemming.
Hi, hello. Thank you. So my question is, we know that solid organ recipients and other immunocompromised people have a much lower chance of responding to the vaccine. And also, if they develop COVID, then they have a much higher risk of getting very severely ill and even dying. Many of these people who are immunocompromised were previously shielding, but since sometime in May, they have had to go back to work. And this includes people who work in what we might call frontline jobs, such as being bus drivers or working in schools or being nurses or cleaners. So my question is it time to think about focused protection for this specific group of people? That might include extending the furlough scheme for some of those people, or perhaps putting in place special extra measures in their workplace, perhaps moving them from that very front line position and moving them into more protected roles within their workplace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla. Who'd like to address that? Well, Dinan, yeah.
Let me make a stab at that. It's a complicated question, Carl, but I really appreciate you asking, and it's a major issue because there are significant numbers of people who are immunocompromised for a variety of reasons in the population. And you're absolutely right. Vaccines are less effective in people whose immune systems are damaged. I mean, I think that there is research going on to see what the optimal vaccine strategy should be with regard to boosters and so forth. And it is also, if such individuals do actually get ill with COVID, of course, there's the opportunity for using monoclonal antibodies as a treatment in hospitals, which actually gives you the antibodies that otherwise the vaccine will have elicited. So I think this is important. I will leave it for others to comment on that. I think even more difficult question is should there be some sort of long-term shielding? Because of course, equally, people who are on immunosuppressive therapy, particularly mild immunosuppressive therapy following transplantation, the idea is to actually be able to get back to life, full life, and fulfill themselves. So I think it's a balance there. But of course, ultimately, here is yet another reason why we should not be aiming for allowing circulation of the virus, but actually suppression of the virus as much as possible, including, of course, immunizing children, who may be an ongoing vector of transmission. Thanks.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Carla. We're a few minutes left. I'm going to squeeze in the last question now, which comes from Andy Brooks. Andy.
Hello. My question is, to what extent is the UK's failure to control the pandemic down to a failure of our democracy? For example, our democratic institutions have failed to enable wise decision-making and also failed to hold decision makers to account.
So, Martin and Gabriel, I think. Martin.
Yeah, well, you know what, this is, we don't have time to go into all of this. I would simply say that you might look up some of the stuff that I and others have written on governance, you know, the basic principles of transparency, accountability, participation, integrity, and capacity, the TAPIC framework, where we've applied that to the UK in the past and found that the situation is wanting. But I'll stop at that point. But I think you've captured a very important point, which we have written about at length elsewhere.
Thank you. Last point to you, Gabriel, before we wrap.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it that we are in a weakened state of democracy, particularly as regards health matters, with local authorities with precious little responsibility for public health, although the public directors of public health are supposedly centred there. They've had their budgets reduced quite dramatically, and the NHS has been centralised into NHS England. Public Health England which is about to be abolished, of course, or disappear, has been centralised into the Department of Health as an executive agency. Even inside NHS and NHS trusts, there is a lack of democracy and a lack of public participation. And I think this de-democratization of health and public health is a really, really substantial problem. It is, after all, runs completely contrary to all of the public health efforts that did so much for us in the sanitary revolution of the 19th century and through into the 20th century, and did so much, for example, in my own hometown of Belfast, to build schools that were healthy, well ventilated, well lit, because that was what they saw as their democratic duty to do for all of the people. And we've lost that a whole strand of democracy. We've seen a hollowing out of the democratic state and a concentration, a substantial and worrying concentration in the hands of Whitehall and Downing Street in particular.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Thanks, Andy, for your question. And that's it. We come to the end of today's briefing. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thank you to the press and the public for all your questions. Thank you, of course, to Independent Sage for all your continued efforts. And of course, thanks to our special guests, Claire and Marion. Information is empowering. Independent Sage will continue to advise, sharing the science and advising on the best way to navigate this pandemic, to protect ourselves and to protect others. All the reports are available on the website. Please follow us on Twitter and Instagram if you don't already. and see you all hopefully this time next week. Stay safe. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Jim. Bye all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.